this webinar is important because we know that NDCs are the most important tools that the African countries and of course other development countries have prepared as a way of contributing or committing to the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is currently the main international policy that is supporting climate change. And because Africa is actually at the center of climate change impacts in terms of vulnerabilities and also in terms of even the opportunities that climate change come or bring to the continent, it is important that some of these NDCs that have been prepared by countries within the continent can be effectively implemented, because at the moment we have them as documents, and I know there are actions that are going on in different parts of the continent, but there is need to upscale that particular action. And for many, in many situations, there has been discussions around these NDCs, the African NDCs. And one of the key things that come out in these discussions is that these NDCs are good, but there is need to support the means to implementation. So the means to implementation in this case includes the technologies that we need to put in place in order to achieve the mitigation and adaptation actions, but also the resources that are required to be able to push or to be able to put these actions into reality. So it is very important that this kind of discussions or this kind of initiatives basically come in to be able to reinforce the element of implementing the NDC. So this is very important for us, and we hope that we can continue with the discussions as we ensure that our NDCs are implemented, not only implemented for the sake of it, but also implemented effectively, because we know that the negotiations have come, are coming to an end. So the most important thing now is to go into actions. And with those few remarks, I would like to then invite Dr. Christine to be able to introduce the Frankfurt team and the activities that they do within the school. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanne, for the nice words. Welcome to everyone. I'm really looking forward also to see so much participation later in the fellowship. As Joanne already told, we are from the Frankfurt School of Finance and Management. That's a business school which is based in Frankfurt. And the Frankfurt School does not only have the faculty part, but also the advisory service, where we have teams working on education and capacity building, especially also in the area of climate finance. And we have a huge team who are working on project implementation and also on research. And I think this project shows exactly also what is our typical angle. It's we see there's really high demand for implementation of climate finance in various areas, but it needs to involve different actors. From the one side, from the business, on the other side, also researchers are really important, but also the policy makers. And this also represents a bit the idea behind our fellowship project, which is also based on long experience. As we see, it's important to bring together these different stakeholders. Typically, these stakeholders have different, the environment where they work, and also the different way how they are used, the language they are using. And one aim of the fellowship, which is really to have the opportunity to bring together different researchers and policymakers, to give them the opportunity to meet, to discuss, and also to understand each other. I think both are really important to drive forward this. On the Frankfurt School side, it will be on the one side, you can also see my colleague Jonas, who will later give a huge introduction exactly to the whole idea of the fellowship project and how to apply. And then we have also Peter, which has worked quite a long time also in NDCs and has developed the NDC tracker jointly with others, for example, Kennedy. And myself, I'm working more in the area of investments or barriers to investment from climate finance, also like which financing instruments are relevant and to implement. Because as journals already said, like the NDCs, they are written, they need to be renewed. But now the next step is really how to implement them also from the financing side. That's also a bit to point out in case you're interested in this fellow project. So we are not like the development of the NDCs, that's not really the content of the fellowship. It's really about discussing with each other and showing what are the means or how could you then implement on the financing side or the regulatory side an existing NDA. With this, I think I would like to give some information about some rules for the webinar. We would first give like a short overview about the African perspective on NDCs, to give like a bit like a key speech, some ideas to discuss. Then later this perspective on the regional perspective on NDCs. And in a third step, we will present the whole project. If you have really important questions, I think you are all over the COVID, everyone is now Zoom expert. There is the chat, so where you can really put some really immediate questions. Otherwise, we have after these 3 presentations a dedicated area for question and answer, where we would really ask you to ask every question, because it's a great opportunity to get to know what you are looking for. And with this, I think I would hand over to Kennedy to start with the first presentation.
As Kennedy prepares, just to announce that this event is being streamed live on Facebook and YouTube as well. Yeah, but on Facebook. So, and also we are doing a recording just for your information. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine and Johannes. So I hope everyone can see my screen. Great. So I'll spend the next few minutes just giving a context of the African NDCs and sort of why this project is important, just giving the broader context before my colleagues go into the specifics. So I think I'd like to first acknowledge that part of what I'll present is from ongoing previous work with colleagues, some of the colleagues who are now at the Frankfurt School. So I think it's very nice to see that collaboration spilling over and sort of yielding such a project that we have at the moment. So I think that's quite interesting. So I'll start by first presenting some of the research just to give you a context of why we should care much about African NDCs. So if you look at the African continent, so this is data from the NDC Explorer, which is a tool that we built collaboratively with some of the colleagues at Frankfurt School and also some of the colleagues who are at ARIN. So we look at the global division by income. When you look at the African continent, you'd see many of the low-income countries are actually in the African continent. So that in a way gives you a very broad perspective on the context of the very limited resources that African countries have, even though they have quite numerous challenges to deal with. So if we zoom in a little bit deeper and first look at NDCs. So what are NDCs? So NDCs stand for Nationally Determined Contributions. And these are the main instruments that are meant to sort of address climate change at the national level. So in 2015, countries agreed on the Paris Agreement on climate change. This marked almost 30 years of trying to get an international agreement that would work for all countries. So under the Paris Agreement, every country or party, because some countries put together a common NDC, are expected to submit a national climate change plan under the Paris Agreement, what we are now calling the NDCs. And then all African countries, except Libya, I think because of the conflict that they have, the ongoing conflict, submitted an NDC. What is very interesting about the African NDCs is, there are a couple of reasons why African NDCs are quite interesting, and we'll see in the following slides. So first of all, many of the African NDCs were submitted within the context of sustainable development. So when you read through many of the African NDCs, they said we'll deal with climate change mitigation, we deal with adaptation, but all this is within the broader context of sustainable development. So you can see how there's a very strong connection between sustainable development and climate action in Africa. So that is one of the really strong points about the African NDCs, that we had other NDCs from other parts of the world drawing a connection, that connection, but not as strong as African NDCs did. And that's very important because when you look at the very specific aspect of sustainable development goals, not many countries across the world, as you can tell by the darker shades, connected their NDCs to the SDGs, that is the Sustainable Development Goals, because the SDGs and the Paris Agreement form part of the 2030 UN UN Sustainable Development Agenda. So you can see a little bit of a weak connection with the Sustainable Development Goals, even though from the previous slide you could tell there is a strong connection between climate action and sustainable development in Africa. So when you zoom in deeper now into the African NDCs and some of the specific elements, first of all was the means of implementation of fairness and equity. So if you look at the the map of Africa and the African countries therein, the deeper the color, that means the more the NDCs had a very explicit request for support for implementation. That includes finance, that includes capacity building, and that includes technology transfer. And all this is within the concept of equity and fairness. So African countries say we will do X amount, we will contribute X amount of climate action, but if we get support, we will go some extra steps over and beyond what we've committed, and we'll be able to do it. So that's very important because you can see there's a very clear gap between what African countries can eventually do, that is the potential for climate action, and their ability to the capacity that they have to, meet that degree of climate action. So if we dig deeper, we found that many African NDCs actually had two types of commitments. Number one, they said, okay, we will contribute to mitigation. We will put in a certain amount of our own resources. But if we get more resources in mitigation finance, then we will step up our climate action on finance. You can see a similar trend for adaptation. And that's very interesting as well, because adaptation is a very important issue for African countries because it's a very vulnerable continent. So many African countries are actually struggling to deal with, to cope with the impacts of climate change, and they have strained resources because they have to other competing development needs. So adaptation is also very acute and is a very important issue. And if we also look at the issue of capacity building, you could see many African countries requested support for capacity building in their NDCs. And this is an especially important issue for this project, because this project is meant to build capacity. So you can see the project is responding to a very, very direct issue that is very pronounced about African NDCs. So if we summarize all that information, what we see, number one, all African countries, of course, submitted an NDC, and that means there's a very strong commitment policy-wise from African countries to contribute to global efforts to deal with climate change under the Paris Agreement. Second, we find that many or most of the African countries' NDCs are conditional on support for finance, whether it's mitigation or adaptation, and also capacity building and technology transfer. So that means that they had most NDCs had a component where African countries contributed to do an X amount, but if they get additional support, they would step up their climate action. That's a very important aspect of the NDCs, and it's very critical to meeting the targets of the Paris Agreement, and especially for this project that we have. So there's a very strong connection as well between climate change and sustainable development. And I think for the African context, that's a very, very important issue. And I think we've paid close attention to that in the project, where even though the focus will be on climate finance and climate change, but we'll be very keen to look at how that connects with the broader issues of sustainable development, such as energy, health, gender, etc. So there's that strong connection, which came out clearly in African NDCs, but also one that we'll look at clearly. So finally, there's a lot of emphasis in the African NDCs for support on capacity building. And this project speaks very directly to that need, where by training researchers and policymakers, there's a very direct contribution to strengthening the capacity of African countries to tap into some of these resources to deal with climate change. So I think I'll leave my presentation at that, and my colleagues will take over in the next phase. So thank you very much for that.
Okay. All right, thanks, Kennedy. So next is to invite our regional focal points to provide some perspective. So we are going to start with Professor Kalaba, who is going to lead the process and is going to talk a bit about the Southern Africa perspective, but also, just reflecting a bit more broadly on the issues being discussed. Then we'll have our different focal points from the other regions, also making some comments that align to the process. So, Professor Kalaba, please.
Thank you so much. So let me just share my screen with everyone. Okay. Thank you so much. So I will talk about the Southern African perspective, but I think I would like, first of all, to also give a regional perspective of the NDCs. And within my presentation, I want to talk about the challenges that climate change and variability is, its challenges to the region, as well as to Africa as a whole, and then look at climate financing in sub-Saharan Africa, then also discuss briefly our past failures in implementing related activities, because it's extremely important for us to know where we're coming from so that we can forge ahead, and then looking at catalyzing NDCs, and then the funding needs and delivery, and provide some concluding thoughts. As we may all be aware, I know that we are joined by people coming from different backgrounds in this webinar, but it is important to emphasize the fact that sub-Saharan Africa contributes the least to the accumulation of GHGs, yet we know that the continent is actually very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And this is largely because of our dependency on natural resources-based livelihoods. And this is obviously true for Southern Africa as well as other regions within the continent. This is largely because of obviously the dependence on rain-fed agriculture, where projections show that there will be a serious decrease in yields, and there will be, again, also increase in prevalence of diseases for humans, livestock, and so on and so forth. And this will translate in a serious increase in food prices. So we all know and agree that climate change is actually the greatest economic challenge of our times. Now, the NDCs have obviously raised a lot of interest because of the intrinsic link that is there between the climate change as well as fostering national development. This is why African countries have overwhelmingly assented to the Paris Agreement. And because the vulnerability of the region, like in Southern Africa and Africa as a whole, compels that there is actually put in significant investment or significant funding to help adapt. Now, focusing more on adaptation, but obviously when you look at NDCs, we're looking at both the mitigation and adaptation side. Now, for those who may not be very familiar with the happening, so we know that with mitigation, just simply looking at reinforcing global response to various threats. Now, Southern African region is quite interesting region in the sense that when you look at investment in mitigation, most of the resources are actually invested in South Africa because of the various projects going on there. But what is quite critical in a number of countries within the region is actually the issue to do with adaptation, Why? Because we want to enhance the adaptive capacity, strengthen resilience, and reduce vulnerability to climate change. And we are looking at these things within the context of people whose livelihoods are severely dependent on natural resources. As a result, climate change is negatively affecting us. As a result, the need to adequately adapt and respond to these challenges. Now, when you look at climate financing, the figure before you just gives us an idea of how much money has been spent and where, and this data came from the climate finance update. But obviously you can see money coming from various sources. But one of the things that we need to know is that when you look at the region, most of the climate financing is actually concentrated in South Africa. Why is it that it's not the case in other African countries and also other countries in the region? Maybe largely because of the issues of capacity that we are already talking about and the issues of capacity that this project will seek to address. Now, within the region, the NDCs focus mainly on agriculture. Now, when you look at agriculture, it is looked at from both the mitigation and the adaptation side. From the mitigation side, we are looking at investments around sustainable agricultural practices and agroforestry. These are practices that will allow the planting of trees, which then will contribute to mitigating climate change through carbon sequestration. But on the other side, again, we are looking at agriculture from the adaptation side, where we're saying, how should we now respond in this agriculture, which is actually the main source of livelihood? How can we adapt to climate change? And we've seen a lot of investment in improving seed varieties, in coming up with various interventions within the sector. We again also have another challenge, another focus in the NDCs across the region, focusing on water, management of water catchment areas. Energy is also a big thing. Now, in the region, we experienced severe droughts 2 years ago. And even last year, there were some countries within the region that did not receive sufficient rainfall. And this is actually now affecting hydroelectricity generation because of the high dependence on hydroelectricity generation. Now, what happens then is that there's increased load shedding hours, whereby a number of communities will go without power for a long time. And the implication of that is that people will look for alternatives. And the alternatives that they're looking for or towards are alternatives that are unsustainable. This is actually now increasing the demand for charcoal. So these are the issues. So we have also sectors around the forestry, focus also around disaster risk management, as well as around transport. So the NDCs within the region actually focus in those key areas. Now, one of the things that we need to appreciate is that we have to ask ourselves the question, where are we coming from? And with all these investments, why is it that the impact has not been huge on the ground? There's been no implementation that is in carrying out the policy directives. One is because of lack of finances. Human resource is also a huge challenge. Then there's also lack of explicit consideration of various vulnerable groups, including looking at issues around gender. So as a result, you find that the necessary people that are supposed to be helped are not helped. Then there's also lack of coordination, where you find that there's little coordination on the ground. But it's interesting now that within the policy framework around the NDCs, there's a call for coordination at national level, where you're looking at various departments coordinating. And there's also sometimes lack of policy coherence, where you find that in some countries, policies are not actually speaking to each other. As a result, these have led to failure in implementing the various strategies that have been developed in the past. Now, this information is extremely important because he who is wise knows why past measures have failed and builds on them to come up with a more resilient strategies to ensure that they achieve the required results. So obviously, if we were to catalyze NDCs, we are looking at the need for technical resources within the region, the need for financial resources. Now, when we're talking of the need for financial resources, the other issue is accessing resources. Yes, we hear of billions of dollars being available for the implementation of NDCs, but the second question is that, do we have the capacity to develop bankable proposals? is this capacity there or not? And obviously that capacity is often lacking. They obviously need to consolidate policy frameworks, and this again will be answered by this fellowship, because if you're looking at consolidating policy framework, we need to bring on board the various policy makers so that they are provided with the necessary training, and that coordination between the policy makers, researchers, and people from academia coming together. The other thing that is extremely important within the region will be actually the participation of private sector, because when you look at climate finance, there is very little participation of private sector. So there's need for obviously innovative ways of doing that. And as I earlier alluded to already, there's need for training of human resources to enhance regional and cross-regional learning. So there's need to ensure that we have regional and cross-regional learning. That is why ARIN provides this wonderful network to provide to help us do that necessary cross-learning. When you look at funding needs and delivery within the continent and also coming down just to the Southern African region, funding needs for adaptation, that was, according to the World Bank, I think there were huge sums of money that, as you can see, billions of dollars that are needed. But the level of funding reaching the continent is actually not enough to meet the various needs, and including immediate needs for adaptation. So if we are saying that is the case, then therefore there's actually need to sharpen our skills and learn how best we can access these resources. There's a gap also between funds that are approved and funds that are dispersed on projects. Now, this obviously shows some serious bottlenecks in program implementation. Now, my concluding thoughts as I think of the region, Southern African region, also look at Africa in light of the NDCs as well as in light of our fellowship. I think the full potential of NDCs will only be realized once we have, I think, a serious resource mobilization, which unfortunately has not yet been achieved. So that's a huge challenge. So there's actually need for that. Then the other thing is the level of financial consideration and investment plans. I think there's need for investment, and this should actually be done at a level that is commensurate to the needs that are available. There's also need for reliable data sources and comprehensive sector analysis so that we actually look at the various sectors that have been identified. How best can we approach this? There's need also for targeted approach where we're having a good understanding of the functions of different actors, especially the private sector in the climate finance landscape and the timing processes of climate change funds and national budgets. Now, I have to emphasize the fact that as we look at the fellowship, in as much as we're looking at various policymakers, there will also be obviously need to engage the private sector so as to pick their minds and help us march together in this extremely important activity. So, colleagues, I think these are my initial thoughts for the region, and I trust we're going to continue having honest discussions.
Okay.
Around this. Thank you so much.
Yeah, many thanks, Prof. That was really very insightful. And of course, as we've emphasized, resources would be very important in terms of ensuring that the ambitions of the NDCs are realized. So it's also about, the resources being available, but also about the effective use of those particular resources. So we need capacities on both sides to be able to, mobilize the resources, but also to be able to allocate and use those resources much more effectively to deliver the desired results. So I would like just to bring in other regional focal points. I have Kezia, Dr. Kezia Mwanga, who is standing in as the East Africa regional focal point. Kezia, do you want to give some 1 or 2 minutes comments?
Okay, sure. So thank you for this opportunity. I think I just want to echo what the presenters have talked about, and especially what Kalaba just finished saying. I think it's important that most of the African countries have committed themselves to climate change and the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. But I think, as we all know, plans themselves are not sufficient. So we need backing of those plans with the right technical skills and the right finances to be able to implement that. And I think one of the areas where we can, make some progress is being able to help those who are at the forefront of implementing these plans to be able to translate these global and national goals into local action. For instance, if we are talking about city managers and city planners, what is it that they can do to be able to translate, for instance, in the case of Kenya, we are hoping that we can introduce our greenhouse emissions by 30% by the year 2020. But for the local planner, what is it that they can do to be able to contribute towards the achievement of these goals? For instance, let's say one of the ways we can think about is NMT, or the use of non-motorized transportation. But then how can they be able to actualize this? How can they be able to mobilize the resources for this? And how can they be able to also, be able to inform the communities that they are planning for and they are providing services for, to actually be able to adapt to some of these measures. So I think it's really critical to I think climate change is one of the complex, concepts that we talk about. But then it's important for people to be able to translate, these global goals and national goals to local actions that everyone can be able to contribute. If you're in every sector that people know, this is some of the small actions that I can take to be able to contribute to the overall national or global goals. I think that's my contribution for now. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kezia. So I want to move then to the Francophone region, and I want to call upon Dr. Antoine Faye. The name is a bit, nice. So Dr. Antoine, if you're there, you could give some 2-3 minutes commentary.
Hi, how are you? If I speak French, none of you is going to understand what I'm going to say. And I doubt that there is more than 3 people that are from French-speaking country in this group. I can say by the name that I think I have a Cameroonian here. Is it true, Kamti? So just to introduce, to tell you how difficult it's going to be to have to jumpstart this network, because we will need everyone on board. And the very difficulty that we always face in Africa is this divide between people from speaking English and people speaking French, and not saying that we have 2 or 3 countries that are Lusophone, either Portuguese or Spanish. The problem here with the NDCs in Francophone country is, first, we have had very difficulties to elaborate them, because all the reference working paper were in English. It's always happened when it's come from the UN system. It's something very difficult. And then what you're gonna find out is probably the help that we need is following a path of you were my ancient colony, so I'm going to help you. You were not my ancient colony, I'm not gonna do nothing with you. And then it's not really interest-free when people are doing that, because you know that if we're gonna do meaningful mitigation, we will have to use like new technology in terms of energy, in terms of agriculture, in terms of transportation. And these are not technology that we have ready in our country. So we will have to go and buy them somewhere. So it's always something that we become consumer while trying to participate into the global fight on climate change. And this is why most government in Francophone country are really adamant into going through the process. It's nice, you produce a NDC, you explain to your government, you have had dialogue and everything, but no one is really moving to implement it. Although you come up with probably a trajectory of how to finance it, they're not going to listen to you. So we need to have deep research and produce like more convincing result. And for that, my point of view is we have national determined contribution, and we should have financing determined contribution. The finance should not be coming only from outside. If we have to link this fight with the sustainable development goal, it should be like country ownership financing. They have to start first by integrating it into their budget process, because this is the concern of countries. So if we don't do something to show to people that we are committed to go through all the process, then forget about financing, because what I can tell you is I've been in this process for a long time. It's very difficult to convince the mechanism, the financing mechanism of the UNFCCC, which are the new Green Climate Fund and the old Global Environmental Fund, how to demonstrate that your project is in fact bankable in their term, because you have to demonstrate that was not climate change. This is something that I could have done myself, but because of the impact of climate change, and that's where you need some real data that we don't have in Africa. No country in Africa can tell you that they have 100 years data that they can bring on to show a baseline, and really from that baseline to where we are today, to see what is the gap or what is really the real impact on for adaptation. So I don't think we have a problem with the mitigation let's say the mitigation process, because it's something that we will need anyway to do in our country. We will need to have green transportation. We will need to use renewable energy, because continuing to do like extension of transmission line is not going to be possible. All of these technology, we will need them, but the problem is really with adaptation, and this is where I think we have to focus. And I'm really happy to be involved in this process, and I know that it's something that we can get working with all the African human capital that we have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. We are now going to the point where we want to introduce the project, but before that, I don't know whether Dr. Albert is online. Albert is our West Africa focal point. Albert, if you're online, you could also just give a quick 1 or 2 minutes comment before we introduce the project now. Okay. Yeah, it seems Albert jumped out briefly. But now is the time that now it would be important to listen to what this NDC fellowship project is all about. And to that extent, maybe it would be then great to bring in Dr. Christine and Jonas, both from the Frankfurt School, to be able to give us a presentation on the same, including how what people need to do in order to be considered for the fellowship. Christine, please.
Okay, I hope you can see the presentation now. You can see it, I hope?
Yes, we can.
Great, okay, great. So thank you very much, first of all, for the introduction, Johannes, and all the other colleagues for this very setting the floor. Is very impressive what has already been done, but you also have clearly pointed out what still has to be done. We are very happy to have this joint project together with the African Research and Impact Network, because we see that there's a lot of demand for capacity building, but also what is also from our perspective like very important is like to have, including what also was just raised, the aspect of a bilingual approach. So not only targeting the capacity development in English language, but also in French language. So that's why we set up this bilingual NDC financing fellowship program. But I would like to present to you within the next minutes. We have said already a few things. What is the objective of the program? It was very nice introduced already by Kennedy and Johannes as well. So basically the idea is to provide capacity building for 2 main target groups, and also to link these 2 target groups together in order to generate first more knowledge, but in the field of financing NDCs, how implemented NDCs are being financed, how investments and how finance resources are mobilized especially in sub-Saharan African countries. And for that purpose, we have 2 target groups, which is on the one hand policymakers really working in implementation, but also in design of national plans, for example, but also especially with a very strong focus on NDCs on the one hand. But also we see that it's very important also that implementation and also the financing of NDCs on ground is also accompanied by very strong research, and which creates new evidence actually when we are and so that this evidence can then be integrated also in the design and the setup of new projects, as also have mentioned already. So what is it all about? Here are a few key facts. So we are offering 2 intakes, as I have mentioned, to take in consideration this bilingual approach. So we will have first intake for 1 month, for 12 months, 1 year, from September 2020 to August 2021 in English language. And then, more or less, starting half a year later, from March 2021 to February 22, we have an intake in French language, where we will just do the same, but in French. For this application, the application period will start probably mid of October. We will then also provide further information about the French-speaking intake. And yes, as I have said already, the project is set up together by the African Research and Impact Network, ARIN, and the Frankfurt School of Finance and Management. Here, especially from 2 departments of our school. One is the one which you can see in the logo on the presentation slide, which is the Frankfurt School UNEP Collaborating Center for Climate and Sustainable Energy Finance, which is actually a think and do tank supported by the UN Environment in order to, on the one hand, do research with regards to climate finance, especially, and also renewable energies, but on the other hand, also implementation of projects as well as education. And on the other hand, we have included also the Sustainable Water Academy at Frankfurt School, which is actually the executive education provider, especially targeting at developing countries. And I am also happy to have already noticed that one of our students is also here in this webinar today. Okay, let me quickly then introduce to you the different components of this project, so you get a bit familiar about what is it all about, or what can you expect. So basically the whole idea is to create a global network of NDC financing ambassadors. People really who knows about how to finance, how to generate, how to mobilize funding in order to finance the implementation of NDCs. And as I have said, beginning we have a call for application. This is already available on the website. The deadline is 31st of July, so I have 4 weeks left until the end of the application period. We then, out of the application what we receive, we will then choose up to 50 fellows who will participate in an e-learning course, which is called the Certified Expert in Financing NDCs. Frankfurt School has already like 10 years of experience in developing and setting up and implementing e-learning courses through our own platform, but we are hosting it here. And that's why we came up with the idea, okay, let's have at the beginning really an e-learning course which sets the basis, which generates equal knowledge about among all participants who are involved in this project. So we choose 50 fellows out of all the applications who then participate in this e-learning course for free. Then, because we are not only thinking that e-learning has a lot of advantages, but also classroom training, also the face-to-face interaction is also very important. Yes, we know that it's quite, right now it's a bit difficult because of the COVID-19 situation, but we are also optimistic that next year when this activities will be implemented, that we can implement this training as well. So out of these 50 fellows who have been accepted for the e-learning course, we will choose the best performing 20 to participate in a series of other capacity building measures. On the one hand, we have a policy on NDC financing academy, which is designed in order to see, okay, how different policies are financed already, what are the key measures, how stakeholders can be involved, etc., and how private money from private sector can be mobilized here. This is the one perspective. The other perspective is really to create also leadership skills, because we want also in this program to create really leaders, future leaders in this regard. So from the policy, but also researcher, because they might also sometimes change the career to be policymakers as well. So that's why we said leadership activities are also very important for this training. So again, we have first here the certified expert in financing NDCs. And based on that, we choose up to 20 fellows who will participate in a series of capacity building measures on site. The leadership for NDC Financing Academy will take place in Frankfurt and hosted by the Frankfurt School. The policy on NDC Financing Academy will be hosted in Nairobi in Kenya and will be managed by the African Research and Impact Network. To bridge the time also between those two academies, we also will design a webinar series where we will provide, on the one hand, presentations from experts in the field. Christine has already mentioned that one of our colleagues, Dr. Peter Paul, he together with Kennedy was very involved in developing this NDC Explorer. He will also be part of the expert team. But also we want like to provide this opportunity to share lessons learned from the different countries and to share lessons learned and also generate new knowledge. So after that we will have just to say again, so everyone who was accepted will participate here, and we will choose one researcher who will then do a 2-month internship at Frankfurt School for the first intake, for the English-speaking intake, and for the second intake, which is the French one, we will choose one research intern who will do a 2-month internship at ARIN institution in Kenya. And basically, the idea here is that the researcher will develop and work on a policy paper or on a short research project, supported by the experts from ARIN as well as from Frankfurt School. And the idea is that they publish at the end a journal article in order to spread also the word in the academic field about what has been learned, what has been investigated during the last years. And this is basically the idea of this research internship. So this process will be done twice, one for English, for the English-speaking intake, the other one for the French-speaking intake. And at the end, because we also want to, what has been already discussed, so this inter-regional or cross-regional exchange, we will organize the bilingual final summit where we bring French as well as English-speaking participants together in order to present new insights, what has been learned out of the program, what has happened until then, etc. So this is the idea to bring them all together at the end. So basically, this is the setup of this project. I will now quickly go through again the call for application, what has been published already 1 week ago. So we have the application deadline, what I just mentioned, which is on July 31st. The project website, you see here the link, you can click on it and just scroll through the website as well. I just want to quickly also have a look again about the profile, what we are looking for. For example, for the research fellows, we are looking for more or less early career, local researchers in universities, or also for ministries, research centers, or action research NGOs who will work on a research project. We we suggest that this research should be in the framework of one of the following topics. The first topic would be around NDC financing, but for example, financing projects within that contributes to the achievement of the committed NDCs, but also program development. Then we have a second topic, which is finance of climate and environmental policy and strategies. We have a third topic, which is about financing sustainable development, transformation. So really looking a bit more on the macro level. And last but not least, because we thought it's very important, like to if you're talking about NDCs, how they can be aligned with the current impacts that a lot of economies and other countries experience and with regard to COVID-19. So this is a special topic which should deal with the impact on of COVID-19 on NDC implementation. And we also expect that there might be some good research ideas which then can be followed to generate more knowledge and also to support countries then to how they can deal with the situation. This is about the research fellows. Then for the policy track, we are looking for young and mid-career professionals, primarily from the public sector. We are looking for people who have around 5 years of work experience, but it's not an exclusive criteria, working in one of the following sectors. It can be water, agriculture, but also infrastructure and all other or who are involved in assessing or delivering, monitoring about climate finance in the respective ministries. And if possible, they should also have already been in touch with NDCs or with regard to climate change and climate adaptation finance or climate policy implementation. So this is about the call for application. Then I have a last slide, what I want quickly to show you what about the certain steps of the application process so that you will be guided through. First of all, you go on the website, ffs.de/idrc/ndcffp. And in step 1, please visit the website. And in this website, we have provided already a lot of information. We have included terms and conditions, but also a really detailed application guidelines, which you can download. Here I will show you. So here's the apply. You can click here in order to register to our platform and then be guided through. And here, here you see there's a document which are the application guidelines, which really will guide you step by step through this whole process, so that you will not get lost over the way, because I know that it might sound a bit complicated, but at the end you will see if you read it through and follow the instructions that it's really self-explaining how you should go through the steps. Then step 2, give me a second. Step 2, you will receive login data, etc. So please then log in and read also additional information. In this section, you will also already find for the researcher, you find the research proposal template and already also a list of the different questions that you will be asked in the application form. So there you can prepare your answers so that you can have to only then open the application form in this section here, and only have to just copy paste your answers and then you can submit it. And the step 3 is, yes, please fill in your application and upload your attachments. For example, we are asking for a CV and also for supporting documents if you have any, and you have to submit it then through the platform by clicking here in the application form, then on submit. But this is everything. All these steps are also explained in very detail in the application guidelines. Okay, I think this was a quick overview of the different of the program. I think with that I think we will open then the floor to Q&A, or Johannes?
Yeah, now I think it's Q&A time. We've been talking a lot, so it would be good to also hear from the participants. Already the number of questions that have come through the chat area, and I'll be able to read this shortly. But in case from our participants, this is the time. If you have any questions, comments, or clarifications, kindly just take it up now. There is a function on, I think it's where you can, raise your hand so that I can see who is interested in giving a comment or asking a question. All right. Any questions, concerns, clarifications? Yeah, as people still think about their questions, I would just like to read a few that have come through the chat box. I think some of them have been responded to, but it would be good basically to expound on them. There's a question from Kennedy here, who is from one of our counties in Kenya, and is asking, how can this project work closely with subnational government in ensuring the implementation of NDCs? Kennedy Mbeva, do you want to respond to that? I know you've responded on the chat, but perhaps you could expound a bit for those who have not been able to read the chat.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Johannes. And I think that's a really interesting question. And I think it brings into focus, when we talk about NDCs and climate change, we're always talking about national governments, but we also forget there are subnational governments, which are very important, especially in the implementation. So I think we'll be very keen to draw that connection in this project, and especially as we are targeting in the policymakers track, we'll try to connect with the various policymakers at the various levels, because if you look at the African context, for example, there's a policy making at the continental level, which is mainly through the African Union and the relevant departments, and also through the regional levels where we have the different regional blocks like the East African Community, COMESA, ECOWAS, etc., who are working on climate change as well and trying to coordinate the national initiatives. But we also have very important policymakers at the subnational level who actually turn those policies into actions and programs and projects. And I think many projects usually overlook them. And I think in this particular project, we'll try to connect with them. And I think that will also be involved with some of the previous and ongoing projects that ARIN is engaged with in sort of working with subnational policymakers and trying to connect them with national and regional policymakers to address very concrete problems or challenges that are facing these subnational policymakers. So I think we'll try to connect with that work and also try to bring in the perspectives and expertise of those policymakers. And we hope that they can sort of apply and engage in the project, because we think they also have a lot to bring, and especially a very important perspective now that we are shifting towards implementation. So I think we'll seek to draw from that work, but we also strongly encourage such policymakers. We'll be on the lookout for them and try to get that information to many of them across the continent. And I think if we can establish that connection across the continent, that will be very useful and very important for the project.
Good. Yeah, thanks. So basically, implementation will have to take place at the subnational level. So counties definitely are very important in terms of ensuring that that implementation takes place, and report is, kind of reported to the national reporting system. There's a question here for Felix about from Jackson Washira, who is a PhD student at the University of Nairobi, and is asking, what is the place of advocacy for prioritization of the climate change adaptation and mitigation within the broader framework of NDCs. So he's talking about advocacy, and he goes ahead to say we are not doing very well in Africa when it comes to advocacy.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much. A point, advocacy has a role. Now, what advocacy does is that it brings on board the views of various stakeholders and also enlightening people about what is happening and their need to respond. So one of the things that I've observed over the years is that due to lack of awareness and due to lack of sharing information with people, people stick to policies that are long gone because they don't actually even know that they are gone. I've had situations in some countries that I've worked where you find a district official implementing a policy that has already been changed, but does not have a new policy from central government. And you start wondering how that is the case. So in trying to emphasize, I think what is key is that we need a lot of advocacy. If we were to bring in a private sector and other partners in implementing the NDCs, I think it's extremely important that there's a lot of advocacy. And linked to the earlier point that Kennedy has ably answered, we're looking at a district, even sub-national and sub-district level. It's extremely important that we also invest in advocacy. But if we're to do that, then even the people that are engaged in advocacy must also be trained, because I've also observed where we have quite a number of people that are advocating, but if you interrogate them, they don't even seem to know what they're advocating. So I think there's need for that.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof. So are there questions from participants now? Yeah, there is, I can see some additional comments from Tunderai. Do you want to raise your question, Tunderai?
I think he was asking about the tracks again, so maybe I can switch to the slide back where I explained it. Okay, so he was here, but maybe I can quickly read out the question. So he's asking, may Jonas Flair explain a bit more on the tracks? I'm interested in participating through the policy track. So yes, about policy track, what I have mentioned, we are looking for really people who are working in ministries or really working also on a local level in implementing or working in developing NDCs or plans which actually should contribute to the achievement of the submitted NDCs to the UNFCCC. So the idea of the policy track is, on the one hand, that to learn and also to exchange with the researcher about, okay, where are still the knowledge gaps, right? So where are the knowledge gaps that should actually be done, and on the other hand, also to share with the researchers, on the other hand, the perspective. So what actually do we need in order to advance with our work, what we are doing on the day-to-day basis? What we expect from the policy fellows here is that they contribute lively to the discussions, but also that they should at the end submit or work on a policy paper that should where they outline, for example, or develop a concept note, for example, for a strategy with regards to financing on a regional level, but also on the national level, but also maybe on the county level. It really depends on, and as you will see also during the application that we also are requesting, also policy fellows to think about a topic they really would like to go more into detail during this program, and to outline also why. I think this is basically what we are expecting from the policy fellows. Maybe Kennedy Mbaba, you can also add something else on that, but basically this is what we are expecting from the policy fellows here.
Yeah. So good. Just to add that the process will be continuous, and we will continue consulting in terms of some of the areas which are unclear, especially for the potential applicants. In terms, following on some of the questions around counties and what, kind of learning can be drawn from this particular initiative, I just want to bring in one of my colleagues who has been working with a number of units, the counties, but also at the national level, as well as various capacity building initiatives at the international level, to just give some perspectives on how this kind of fellowship is likely to spur that kind of learning and be able to sort of promote climate leadership within the continent. So Charles Tanui has been doing this work, and perhaps it would be good to listen to what his perspectives are. Charles, please.
Sorry, you're muted. Yeah, thanks a lot. Like what Dr. Taylor has said, I'm Charles Tanui. I'm a research fellow and co-convener of the Africa Research and Impact Network. I'm really passionate about especially the peer-to-peer learning and of course government and policymakers learning. So I'd like to bring in the experience, especially what we have had in Kenya, and the support especially we got from the project called iCrystal, integrating hydroclimate science into policy decisions for climate resilient infrastructure and livelihood in East Africa, with support from also practical action. So some of the actions that we did was to engage especially with the subnational governments, and we focused on the Lake region. The project, of course, iCrystal was focusing on the Lake region. But what I can share with you is that there is that task, there is that urge and commitment from the subnational government, especially one of my colleagues in the group here has asked a question. It's called Kennedy Oyer, and is the chair of the 14 directors focusing on climate change in the 14 county governments in the Lake region. But what is the most important thing also is that there is the capacity needs, and they've actually expressed. In fact, last year we spent a lot of time going through their the county development plans and teasing out some of the climate actions. And remember, especially for those who are conversant with the Kenyan governance system, county governments are actually tasked to implement some of the devolved functions. When you look at the NDC, and agriculture is a devolved function in Kenya. So how can this special initiative really support the capacity of those county governments, especially the directors who are at the forefront of really implementing those programs? So I think that the initiative is quite timely, and of course, building on the already existing platform where the county governments have come together. We have also engaged with some of the governors, and they are really interested and very supportive. So from the high-level policy to the technical personnel, they are really very supportive. One also, another important factor is how do we customize, especially the capacity building program, especially for these county governments? So we need especially to engage with them quite deeply to get to understand the different needs based on the context, but also look at some of the environmental flows. These counties are affecting or benefiting from the Lake Victoria, and of course the different riverines draining water into the lake also traverse these counties. So when you come from the perspective of implementing the climate smart agriculture, it will going to affect the ecosystem, the river system. So are we going to build their capacity? So this initiative is quite timely, but of course we are going to replicate such approach or such model and that such motivators or champions across Africa. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. And I have some more questions here. I think we have about 10 minutes to conclude. But a few more questions. Now, there's a question from Frederick Dapila, and he's asking, are successful applicants supposed to carry out empirical research on the proposal they will submit? And if so, is there funding available for this? So Jonas, perhaps you can respond to that.
Yes. So yes, you have to do a research which can be carried out within this 12 months of this fellowship program. And unfortunately, we don't have funds to provide funding like to carry out this research. But if you would be selected for the internship, and I think this is also to what Gideon is asking, then you will have the chance to work on this research and to conclude this research as well. For this internship, maybe to quickly also raise again what are the conditions of this internship. So it's a 2-month internship. The program will cover the flight expenses as well as housing, so accommodation as well as board. Unfortunately, we are not allowed, due to the donor institution, to pay a fee or like a allowance or a remuneration for this internship, but the day-to-day costs are covered in this program.
Good, excellent. Another question from Alusa, and he's saying, what background does one need to have to be ideal for this fellowship? I think that is a running question in terms of the requirements. Yeah.
So in general, I think there's no ideal candidate, I would say, because as we have already explained and also was raised in certain of these comments today, this program benefits from the different backgrounds of the participants. So yes, we will look at, okay, whether you have experience with climate change, you will have a look whether you have already experience with like policy implementations, etc., or development of policy plans, but there's no ideal background in terms of, for example, studies, etc., that you're looking for, because we think that also this interdisciplinary learning is will also greatly benefit this program. So there's no ideal candidate, but we really strongly encourage everyone who thinks he could fit into this program to apply.
Good. And this one is to Prof. Felix. What is the place of individual country exports to NDCs? I don't know what country exports mean in this case, but this is a question from Gideon Wangigi. Gideon, do you want to explain what you mean by country exports? Or Felix, do you understand what Gideon is trying to inquire?
Maybe he can just amplify so that.
I'm looking at it. Thank you, Jonas. This is Gideon speaking. I'm looking at it in terms of individual country exports, because even these LDC countries or low and middle income countries like Kenya, we have a sizable contribution to the global trade. And I'm just trying to juxtapose that in view of the national determined contributions in the financing aspect. So can you draw a correlation, something of that sort? Thank you.
Oh, I see. Yes. So if you're looking at export in terms of what a country engages in terms of trade, I don't know if I'll be correct, but looking at as we export, in the whole process we end up emitting. Is it something that is linked to emitting of GHGs as regards to in line with exporting the various products? If that's the case, then obviously we know that through the transportation and many other things, there are GHGs that are emitted, and as we grow in that area, or as we increase our exports, we also need to be conscious. I think this is why in a number of the NDCs, there's also a focus on the transport industry, to be cautious, because in as much as Africa may not be contributing largely to the GHGs, but I think with increase in transportation and movement of goods and services, that landscape may change, and therefore we need to develop there quite cautiously. So I think maybe from the export side, if you're talking of GHGs increasing and linking that with exports, maybe that's what we can say. And though maybe not directly from what you asked, I think it's also quite important for Africa to realize that even though the contribution of our GHGs is not that much, but I think it is increasing, and our development we need to take that into consideration as we seek sustainable development. I think maybe that's what I can say, but if this is not very clear, you can amplify so that maybe I add more flesh, as well as maybe other colleagues can also add to that question, to that answer.
Right, thanks, Prof. And then there are two related questions. One is on the possibility of the private sector being considered in this fellowship. And the other is actually directed to me, the CSO, whether CSOs could be considered because they promote accountability. And maybe very quickly to answer that, this is from Kennedy, is to say CSOs these are civil society organizations, are very critical in terms of policy, advocacy, but also in terms of informing policy in terms of the rights of different groups who are affected by climate change or who have a stake in climate change. So by and large, it's possible that through the policy track, it's possible that some of the good candidates within the CSO ecosystem will be considered for the fellowship. As per the private sector, Jonas, you want to tackle that?
Yes, thank you very much for this very important question. We actually, just maybe to frame this a bit, we also initially we thought about private sector like to having a special track for that. But on the other hand, yes, we know that this is important, but we really in this course or in this fellowship program, we're really looking for policymakers and researcher, even though because yes, we private sector actors are important, but unfortunately are not the key target group of this program. This is yes, what I can say about that.
Yeah, no,
but if you could, sorry, so maybe to end, to add, also to mention, so if you could show in your application that there's a strong need and there's a strong link to NDCs with regards to what you're doing and in your daily job, or what you're doing or what you have done in the past, I think then such a application can also be considered. But it really depends from case to case. But in general, it's not a target group, private sector actors.
All right, thanks. But also private sector is a bit broad. There are those private sector which, they are involved in research, which could be relevant for this. But also there's the private sector contribution or engagement with the policy processes. So there's those windows of opportunity. So I think what Jonas is saying is that if you are from the private sector, it is possible to, be part of the fellowship, but the case has to be clear in terms of the contribution to the policy or in terms of the role or whatever engagement that you have in the research sphere.
Maybe, Jonas, if you allow, also to add as well, what we are really also thinking, because we also think that this exchange also with private sector actors, which are crucial also in order, as you have already heard, to engage in developing and also financing NDCs. What we are thinking also is like to engage them in other steps of this program, for example, during the webinars here that I have mentioned and explained, and also during this final summit, it might be also an option. But first, we were looking about the policy implications, and then we can then we can see how we can engage as well as with the private sector actors, which are crucial to achieve the submitted commitments.
I think our time is almost up. So
I wanted to ask something.
All right, go ahead.
Thank you, Dr.
Yes, Evans.
That is a very good presentation, and I want to thank the organizers for this. What I wanted to ask is we always need to be trying to take some kind of evaluation of such kind of fellowships, how the impact trickles down to the community or to the local implementing, because NDC must be implemented from the ground level, from down at the local level. So we also need to look at how is this fellowship going to impact in the community down there to the people who are actually struggling to ensure that they are able to make a contribution to the NDCs, because that is where it begins. So that is also very, very important in this work, because I remember there is something that was commented by one of the presenters about the triangulation in terms of the plans that are discussed. We keep on doing a lot of plans down at the ground level, but then we need to look at the impact at the implementation of these plans. Do we take stock of what the impact of such fellow or studies or whatever that takes place is having in the society? Or we keep talking about having challenges in climate resilience, yet we are supposed to ensure that something is done at the ground level to bring an impact and also make contribution to the NDC. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan. So perhaps Kennedy and Jonas could take that. The idea around what Evans is trying to ask is about the outcome of this fellowship. Yes, we are targeting the researchers and policymakers, but to that local community who is highly vulnerable to climate change, what does this fellowship mean to them?
Yeah, so I think I'll have a quick stab at it and then pass it over to Jonas. So I think that's a really good question, and I think that's a question that we have been keeping at the backs of our mind, and I think we'll keep doing so. Maybe there are a couple of ways of doing it. The first one is, of course, the trade-offs with a fellowship like this. We'd like to have everyone on board, but unfortunately not. But I think there are windows of opportunity to sort of bring this down to where it matters most, and that's the community level. I think part of that would be the research that will be taken by the policymakers and researchers, and we'll try to bring in that element very strongly so that when they are doing the research on the specific project, they can draw that very strong connection and emphasize what is the importance of sort of the community members of the community who are being targeted. And I think second is, which is a good thing, is this project. We are doing other projects that are very much also tied to the community. So the benefits or the lessons from these projects, from the different fellows, etc., will not be confined to the projects, but we'll also try to connect them with other existing projects, especially those that are connected to the grassroots, and try to see how some of those insights can go all the way to the grassroots, but also from the grassroots all the way up to the project. So I think those are two of the quick ways that I have in mind, but maybe Jonas can sort of share a bit more on that.
I think this. Thank you first for this very very important intervention here. I think this is a very important topic, and I am just having two ideas how we can tackle this. First, we might, for example, one of the webinars, we might, for example, dedicate to exactly this question, how, if you're talking about the policies, how we can bring it to the communities and how communities can benefit from it, and also how communities can, as you said, be then more climate resilient also, etc. This would be one aspect what we can implement in this project. The other one would be, that might be also a very good question, how to tackle this in one of the, for example, in one of the policy fellows might also then write a short paper about this, exactly about this topic, how to bring it down, how to bring policies down to local level, or how to build it up from local level to a national level, etc. So I think there are a lot of ideas how to touch point on that. And yeah, would be happy to, if there's an application, for example, or also participants who really would like to go further in this direction.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe I can just bring in a very short intervention on the same. I think the question is extremely important, but also we need to realize that a fellowship like this may directly or indirectly impact on the local people. So you find that even indirect impacts are extremely important, because if you have well-informed researchers as well as well-informed policymakers who are always in touch with the people on the local level, then it will be important that once they're trained, they have the necessary skills. These skills must be translated on actions on the ground. But also, on what was also already highlighted, the fact that I think we can dedicate one of the webinars to actually also look at vulnerability. Recently, I was doing some work where you look at the various groups that are vulnerable, the people living with disabilities, the elderly, and all these other people. So there must be a sense in which we need to turn the lights of policymakers on to ensure that all strategies that are developed and projects have we look at projects using the lens of the various vulnerabilities that people may find themselves in. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Prof, and thanks to everyone. I think our time has elapsed, and perhaps this is a good point to end it. I think the discussions have been very enlightening, and what comes to mind is that there's still a lot of interesting perspectives to be considered that would also require further discussion. So going forward, I think we will be actually trying to convene such webinars periodically. It's part of what we do within the ARIN network, that we are able to bring people together to discuss and dialogue on some of these issues. So even within the framework of this fellowship, we'll try as much as possible to ensure that the learnings, even if there are categories of people who are not, selected or are not part of the fellowship, there will be learnings that could be shared through such webinars, so that everybody can be able to benefit from them. Our aim basically is to create or to establish a cadre of thought leaders in these particular areas of concern that matter to Africa. So climate change is very critical, and we are passionate really to see that African continent is well represented by a cadre of young people who are able to think transformatively in terms of developing some of the ideas that have been talked about, competent projects, but also in terms of being able to strategize and mobilize resources that would help in the implementation of climate change policies. So going forward, we will continue to consult. I know there are a number of clarifications that are required in terms of the application process. So we are here. Our emails and contacts are available, and you should be free to engage with us, just in case anything is not clear to you. In terms of the discussions that we've had today, we will be putting some of these presentations in on our repository. We have a repository under the ARIN network where you can be able to access this information and be able to reflect and engage with us in asking more questions. Last but not least, we will try to put together some of the key things that have emerged from this discussion. So we normally, have news briefs that basically document some of the key strategic perspectives that emerge from such webinars. So we'll be able to produce one from this particular discussion and share widely with the participants. I think from my side and on behalf of the African Research and Impact Network, I would like just to say thank you very much for your time and for your patience throughout this webinar. Thank you, Jonas and the Frankfurt team, for making time to engage with us. And we look forward to a much more transformative engagement moving forward.